morning, everyone. I'm Jim Ryan, president of the University of Virginia, and I'm grateful that all of you could join us this morning. This is our third democracy dialogue, and it's the first that has an international focus, so I am eager to get started. We kicked off this series on January 6th, 2021, and a little more than a year later, I think the democracy dialogues are more relevant and important than ever. Polarization, misinformation, and declining trust in institutions, exacerbated in many respects by the pandemic, continue to challenge American democracy. As a leading public research university, and given our history, which is intertwined with the founding of this country, I believe UVA has a special responsibility to do what we can to mitigate these challenges, and the democracy dialogues are an important part of that effort. Not only do conversations like this one we'll have today model civic debate, but they encourage all of us to listen to opposing ideas and genuinely engage with one another in a way that's nearly impossible in other forums like social media. So I'm especially grateful to our moderator, Ann Kokas, and to our esteemed panelists, Peter Berkowitz, Elizabeth Economy, and Patricia Kim, for their willingness to participate and share their time and expertise. I'd also like to thank the George and Judy Marcus Democracy Praxis Fund, Ingrid and David Hang, and Jim Murray for their generous support of this series. And a big thanks to the UVA Karsh Institute of Democracy, led by Melody Barnes, and the Miller Center, led by Bill Antholis, for co-sponsoring today's event. Today's democracy dialogue is especially important because I think most would agree that the relationship between the United States and China is critical to economic prosperity, cooperation on major challenges like climate change, and peace among nations. Each is the other's largest trading partner, and they are two leading and influential world powers with sometimes quite different visions of success and how to achieve it. Democracy has become a central issue in regional security, among other areas, such as with China's relationship with the self-governing Taiwan. And yet there may be only so much we can do to influence Chinese action, especially as we face challenges at home. Today's conversation will explore the extent to which a commitment to democratic values and institutions ought to factor into the relationship between US and China, and what we can expect as the relationship evolves. So thanks again to all of you for being here. I'm delighted now to turn it over to Ann Kokas, Associate Professor of Media Studies and Senior Fellow at the Miller Center, who will introduce our panelists and begin the dialogue. Thanks again. And Ann, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, President Ryan. It is an honor to be part of this event, and I am very excited to introduce our esteemed panelists. Peter Berkowitz is the Tad and Diane Taub Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. From 2019 to 2021, he served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff, executive secretary of the department's Commission on Unalienable Rights, and senior advisor to the Secretary of State. He is a 2017 winner of the Bradley Prize and the author of Constitutional Conservatism, Liberty, Self-Government, and Political Moderation. Elizabeth Economy is currently a senior advisor for China to the Secretary of Commerce, on leave from her role as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She is an acclaimed author and expert on Chinese domestic and foreign policy. Economy is the author of the recently released The World According to China, which I'd like to urge everyone to go out and buy because Liz's previous books have all been amazing. And the views she expresses in this book are her own, or the views she expresses in this panel are her own. Patricia Kim is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings and holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. She is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and U.S. alliance management and regional security dynamics in East Asia. Her writing and research have been featured widely in outlets such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the South China Morning Post. And I'd like to thank the audience for being here today for this important discussion. So for our panelists, I'll start with this question. The Chinese military has recently increased its presence near Taiwan, with reports that China has sent fighter pilots into Taiwan's air defense zone. We are also seeing a massive uptake in nuclear arms and other expansion efforts by the Chinese military. In your view, in the event of conflict across the Taiwan Straits, how should the United States proceed to protect democratic values and institutions? How might any U.S. actions in the Ukraine impact such efforts? Let's begin with Professor Economy.
Sorry, I was having a little difficulty unmuting. So look, before we get to the point of conflict in Taiwan, I would say there's a lot we should be doing to ensure that we don't get to that point. And I think that's really the point. And so, while, Taiwan has emerged as this, very attractive and vibrant democracy, I think its actions during COVID have only increased its sort of visibility on the global stage as a really positive example of what a vibrant democracy can do. The United States has been traditionally the sort of sole power that has bolstered Taiwan's security, right, through our Taiwan Relations Act. What I think happened that's been actually very positive is that Taiwan is becoming increasingly integrated into sort of regional informal organizations. More countries in Europe are looking toward the Asia Pacific not simply as an economic, sort of from economic interest, but now are engaging in sort of growing sense that what takes place in the Indo-Pacific is important also to their security and establishing their own Indo-Pacific strategies. You have small European countries. I mean, it's really extraordinary, right? Countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic and Slovakia stepping up and enhancing their diplomatic relations with Taiwan at the expense of their relationship with mainland China. And of course, you've had just over the past month or two, Australia and Japan both step up and say that what happens with Taiwan's security is in some way integrally tied to their own. And I think Australia has even indicated that if it did come to conflict, that it would stand with the United States if the United States were to play a military role. So there's been an enormous shift in Taiwan's position in many respects in the region and on the global stage over the past year or two. And I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have played important roles in attempting to support Taiwan diplomatically. At the same time, I think it's really important that as we are supporting Taiwan diplomatically and politically, right, and sort of helping to raise their profile, that we are at the same time bolstering their military deterrent. And I think, it's a risk that we run when we increase the political without simultaneously increasing the security. And so from my perspective, what needs to happen now, especially as we watch events, playing out with Russia and Ukraine, is that we have to ensure that Taiwan has a sufficient security deterrent. And it's not and I'd be interested in Patty and Peter's perspective on this. From Xi Jinping's perspective, everything he says, sovereignty is a top priority. And unification with Taiwan, he has said, is one of his 14 must-do items. I don't think we can, we need to take him at his word, right? We need to assume that he has Taiwan, in his eyesight. So what should we be doing to secure Taiwan? And I think we need to do a lot more on the security front, and Taiwan itself needs to do more. And last point I'll make, sorry for going on so long, is I think we need to be very careful in every step that we take to bolster Taiwan's diplomatic presence, that we're not simply poking Beijing in the eye, because we don't want to run the risk of seeing what happened with Hong Kong happen with Taiwan.
Right. Professor Berkowitz, would you care to comment?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you for hosting this. And I'd like to pick up really just where Liz led off. I entirely agree that right now, already, we should be thinking about how we make any move by the People's Republic of China on Taiwan more costly than the benefits of maintaining the status quo. And I agree with Liz on the need to pay careful attention to what Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party says about Taiwan. What they've said about Taiwan is that it is a central strategic objective for the PRC to unite with Taiwan by 2049. And we need to understand that the reunification with what they conceive of as the reunification with Taiwan is part of an overall ambition to achieve hegemony within the Indo-Pacific. And we need to appreciate how important the Indo-Pacific is. Already in the Obama administration, everybody here will recall, we learned about a pivot to Asia. Why a pivot to Asia? Well, for plain reasons. The Indo-Pacific is now home to a little more than half of the world's population. It's the world's fastest growing economic region. It shouldn't mean turning our back on the rest of the world, far from it. But we have needed to pay more attention to the Indo-Pacific for a long time. Addressing democracy, a lot is at stake. At first, China's ambition to bring Taiwan under its control is a threat to freedom and democracy in Taiwan. It's also a threat to the free and open international economic order. Taiwan is the source of most of the world's most sophisticated computer chips and a lot of other kinds of chips. And finally, and this goes to the point and that you mentioned about the Ukraine and also back to Afghanistan. Taiwan is friend and partner to the United States. Were we to allow democracy to be crushed in Taiwan, it would have reverberations throughout the Indo-Pacific and throughout the world. It would broadcast to other friends and partners in the region that were not willing to stand up for freedom and democracy. So to prevent conflict, I entirely agree with Liz about this. It's really necessary for the United States to continue the work, if you don't mind my saying, that was launched by Secretary Pompeo in reviving what was then the moribund Quad relations, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, and extend that work of diplomacy, of invigorating relationships also with Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and India, all of which are countries, I believe, that have an interest in preventing Chinese Communist Party hegemony in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Professor Berkowitz. Dr. Kim, how would you like to add in?
Well, thanks very much, Anne. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I think Liz and Peter have covered a lot of good points already. In terms of Taiwan, I completely agree with Liz that what we absolutely want to do is to avoid an actual military conflict in the Taiwan Strait. We don't want to go there. Having said that, I think Beijing's increasing use of coercion vis-a-vis Taipei amid a shift in the military balance in the region toward its favor have raised questions about whether China is seeking to annex Taiwan in the near to midterm future, and what more should the United States and its allies be doing to ensure that Taiwan's future isn't determined through coercion. And I think the way to do this, and it's already been mentioned by Liz and Peter, is that we have to continue to signal to Beijing that the cost of taking Taiwan militarily would vastly outweigh any benefits. And to make this threat credible, it's important that the United States continues to strengthen its own deterrent capabilities, that it helps Taiwan strengthen its own military defensive capabilities. And I think it's also critical that it's not just Washington that's speaking up on behalf of Taiwan, but that many others are expressing their expectation that there is peace in the Taiwan Strait. And so I think the Biden administration has done a very good job so far about encouraging others, allies and partners, to speak up on behalf of Taiwan. And I think this is a good thing. But at the same time, we also need to strike the right balance between strengthening Taiwan and going too far and endangering it. And I think it's important to distinguish between symbolic measures that might do more to provoke Beijing than to actually help Taiwan practically. And we should also think about how can we do more quietly rather than loudly. I think taking out cameras and megaphones when we support Taiwan is totally fine, because the leaders in Beijing, they will notice, but you don't have to do it publicly, because this gives Beijing the option, if it chooses to stand by and not feel like it has to react to everything that we do with Taipei. So that's what I would say. In terms of the Ukraine question, I don't think it's an apples to apples comparison, the Taiwan Strait and Ukraine. But having said that, I think China, our allies around the world, and others are all watching how the United States handles this crisis, whether it coordinates or fails to coordinate with allies and partners. I think all of those are important elements, and so may influence Chinese decision making. But again, I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison.
So I'd like to take this moment to urge our audience members to be sure to put questions in the chat as you come up with questions for the panelists. We love hearing from you. So now what I'd like to do is move from this question of the challenges of conflict to the challenges of collaboration. So during last year's COP26 climate conference, there was a surprise announcement of U.S.-China cooperation. Yet in Washington, there was internal competition surrounding whether or not to collaborate with the Chinese government on climate issues. In your view, is there space for collaboration in this important area despite different models of governance in the United States and China? And I'd like to start with Dr. Kim, and then we'll go in reverse.
Sure. Well, thanks, Dan. So I think the Biden administration's proposition that the United States and China's relationship should simultaneously have elements of competition, confrontation when necessary, and seek cooperation when there are areas of common interest is a very realistic and a reasonable proposition. The United States and China have never had the same model of governance throughout history, but there have been times throughout our relationship where we have cooperated. For example, in the mid-2000s, China and the United States coordinated to get North Korea to the negotiating table to talk about denuclearization through a framework called the Six-Party Talks. The two also coordinated in the past to support the African Union in setting up the new Africa CDC. And of course, there have been also efforts by the US and China to coordinate on climate change, given the reality that that you really can't work on climate change if the two largest economies are not coordinated and working together. And so I think cooperation is certainly necessary. It is possible. You don't have to just do it with states that look like you. And so it's certainly a worthy thing. Now, having said this, I think so far, the United States and China have not been able to establish a sustainable working relationship. So when the Biden administration, as it got into office and put this proposition out there of simultaneously competing and cooperating, Beijing pretty much came out and rejected this framework. It said that Washington cannot expect to cooperate with China, even when there are common interests, if the United States is challenging its policies elsewhere. And I think this rejection was based on some wishful thinking in Beijing that there could be some, big reset in the U.S.-China relationship to some mythical past where we never had any conflict. And that kind of period never existed. And I think this is also based on a feeling among many in China, Chinese leaders and experts and citizens who feel that Washington truly is at fault for the current dismal state of U.S.-China relations. So I think people have come to the realization that this call for a wholesale reset is unrealistic. And the recent Biden-Xi virtual meeting in December, where the two leaders talked about establishing guardrails for the relationship and working together on regional and global challenges, was a positive sign. And hopefully this could serve as a starting point for a more nuanced and bilateral relationship where we do have some cooperation.
Thank you. Professor Berkowitz?
So of course, I agree that we should be cautious and we should pursue opportunities. And of course, preservation of our land, our water, the air we breathe is vital to the United States and to the world. And we cannot deal with these problems without collaboration with the family of nations. That said, that the two greatest powers, right, and most powerful powers, China and the United States, are locked in great power competition, greatly complicates matters. That they're the two biggest economies complicates matters. That one is a liberal democracy and that one is an authoritarian state further complicates matters. We should expect, I think, for reasons Patricia mentioned and some difficult matters I'm going to emphasize, we should expect that the opportunities actually to be narrow. Well, what are the considerations we need to keep in mind? Well, first of all, China is run by the Chinese Communist Party. It is one-party repressive dictatorship. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, toward the final days in office, issued a determination that China is engaged in crimes against humanity and genocide in Xinjiang. Secretary Blinken has affirmed that determination. That makes cooperation much more difficult. It makes it difficult that that the CCP has been engaged in massive intellectual property theft. It makes it also making things difficult is whatever we think of the origins of COVID-19, there's no doubt that the CCP engaged in a cover-up of the virus as it was spreading throughout China. So for all these reasons and more, it seems to me that while the United States has a clear interest in cooperating with, as you all know, by the way, the world's largest polluter, China is responsible for roughly 30% of world global emissions. We have a keen interest in reaching some kind of agreement. There's good reason to be extremely cautious, skeptical, and vigilant in any negotiations with the CCP.
Professor Economy?
Sure, thanks, Anne. So I guess I would say when it comes to issues like climate change, pandemics, proliferation, issues that basically pose an existential threat to the entire world, it is incumbent on us to try to find ways to collaborate or to cooperate or to align. And I think maybe that's a distinction that is worth mentioning, that it may not be possible for us, probably is not possible, frankly, for us to return back to the mid-2000s and late 2000s when you had Hank Paulson, the Secretary of Treasury, setting up the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which had a major focus actually on cooperation with China on issues like deforestation, on climate change, on the environment. I mean, he was very enthusiastic, very energetic in pursuing this, during the Bush administration. It was at a very different time in China. And frankly, the environment was an area of enormous civil society development, right? And then you began to have all these protests around the environment. And so, environmental NGOs were at the forefront of civil society development in China, and it was exciting. And in this respect, the United States played a really important role in capacity building, not only just more broadly with the environment, but frankly, the United States, in the very beginning, China's sort of background on climate change was basically it did paleoclimatology. It had no real scientists or expertise on climate change. And, it was U.S. Economists and energy experts who basically transferred the knowledge to the Chinese, trained them, did did capacity building around how to measure CO2 emissions, at the very outset. So really, the U.S. has, over the past 15 years or so, had a pretty transformative, or more, I would say, frankly, had a pretty transformative effect on the landscape of China's environmental protection, including climate change, really positive, impact. So that kind of energy, no pun intended, is not going to be possible at this particular moment in time. China's not interested. Xi Jinping is not interested in that, right? He's not interested in having a lot of foreign influence coming into China. I think there are still environmental NGOs and capacity building efforts underway. There still is, in limited ways, that kind of partnership taking place between some US NGOs and Chinese NGOs, and we should absolutely continue that. I think at the sort of government to government level, what we should be looking for is probably alignment. We're no longer in a position where the United States is going to think about transferring, environmental technology to China at below market prices. That was something that we used to talk about, right? Because we wanted China to get up to speed, to be able to do things, and they didn't have a lot of money. Now that's not an issue. So we're not going to do that. But what can we do? We can, for example, encourage China, as it has just done, not to export coal-fired power plants through its Belt and Road Initiative. We could think about something even bigger, like an infrastructure summit with the United States and China and others that are very involved in overseas infrastructure, the Japanese certainly, and increasing sort of, China's, the level at which it does infrastructure development through its development, to think about climate resilient infrastructure. I think that's something that the Build Back Better World initiative under the Biden administration is going to do. That's not an advertisement, by the way. I'm just saying fact. So I just think that there are some ways that we can partner, we can align sort of standards and things to help the world that maybe don't actually, come under the umbrella of real cooperation in the way that we would traditionally have thought about it.
I think that this idea of alignment is a really helpful framework to think about, aligning goals rather than actually, sharing. So I appreciate that framing. Now, this is for Professor Berkowitz, and we'll start and then go around. How has social media and the battle against disinformation made managing the U.S.-China relationship more difficult, including in our own domestic politics?
Well, another very big question. I want to
I like to keep it light here.
yes, but that gives a lot of room to answer, so I'm grateful. There are two issues here. One is underregulation, and the other is overregulation. And for the moment, I want to focus on the problem of overregulation. It seems to me that concern about disinformation in the United States and around the world has become a pretext for regulating opinions with which some authorities disagree, and also preventing the expression of opinions that authorities think might be harmful to domestic politics or international politics. And one example that I think we have to grapple with actually directly involves China. Early in 2020, Senator Tom Cotton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo speculated that the COVID-19 virus might have originated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. After all, we know the virus seemed to arise in Wuhan, and the Institute of Virology there examines a number of deadly pathogens and is the only laboratory in China that deals with the family of coronaviruses to which COVID-19 belongs. In February of 2020, Facebook informed the world that it would prohibit any post that suggested that the virus was man-made or manufactured. Around the same time, we now know that Dr. Fauci was the principal advisor to the president, received an email from a prominent scientist suggesting that it was more likely than not that the virus was man-made. We know there was correspondence between Dr. Fauci and Dr. Francis Collins, head of the NIH, in which Dr. Collins said, we must counteract that suggestion because it's a threat to, I think the phrase he used was international harmony. So set aside the issue of what in the training of physicians and the head of NIH provides any kind of expertise or authority in regulating opinions to support international harmony. It seems to me this was an example of severe overreaction. The problem of disinformation is a real one, no doubt. It's related to other issues that we'll discuss. But it seems to me that the United States has the keenest interest, especially as we're locked in serious competition over world order and what kind of regimes should be encouraged around the world, to do our best to ensure that norms of free speech prevail online. I'll add here, could elaborate later, that our norms of free speech have always been consistent with regulation also, especially when speech threatens the immediate incitement of violence and other forms of immediate gross criminality. That's true, but it seems to me that we have to be especially vigilant to see that norms of free speech prevail on the internet.
All right. Professor Berkowitz focuses on questions of free speech. Dr. Kim, are there any other forms of disinformation related to the U.S.-China relationship that you'd like to highlight in terms of the difficulty of managing domestic politics?
Sure. So some broad thoughts. First of all, I think the U.S. and China have very different views on how the internet, how social media should be governed. The United States has traditionally valued freedom of expression and free flow of information, whereas the Chinese government has sought to tightly control speech and information and sort of sanitize the internet that its citizens have access to, and of course skew it in a way that benefits its authoritarian rule. I think here in the US, we haven't figured out exactly how to have a free and open internet while guarding against disinformation that impacts our domestic policies or impacts our relationships with other countries, to control for the risks to minors and so on, all of the risks that come along with an open internet. Obviously, that doesn't mean we want to go to a closed and monitored model either, like the one that China has. So I think it's critical that the United States and its democratic partners continue to work together to think through, what should be the rules and norms for digital governance that is good for democracy. And I think we have a lot to learn from other democratic partners like Taiwan, that has come up with some really creative ways to fight back against disinformation, including ones that come from China. And so I think we have a lot to learn and share, but it's a work in progress.
And Professor Economy, is there anything that you'd like to contribute to this discussion about the challenges of disinformation in U.S. domestic policy related to China?
No, I guess, look, like Peter, I certainly want there to be, open, fact-based debate around ideas and issues. I think that's clear. But, in principle, I'm very much aligned with Patty's comments as well, that I'm not sure that we figured out here in the United States how best to protect ourselves from disinformation. And some of that comes from China, which I'm assuming is part of the reason you're asking this question is, what happened around, January 6th and with COVID and the level, we saw new levels really of China's disinformation coming into, the US. And I think that was also disturbing. And efforts by China to amplify discord in the US, right? To amplify the polarization that our nation has been experiencing. And I think that is very troubling. So I think, we need to pay attention to all of this. And I agree, we haven't found the right path forward. I don't, it's going to be an ongoing debate, but let's try to take it as one of the benefits of a democracy that we can have this kind of open and free and spirited debate about where to draw those lines and how to do that best. So I'll choose to put it in an optimistic framework, but I do think it's concerning. And between the Russians and the Chinese, I think our nation is under threat, as are all democracies.
This is a huge challenge, and once again, I'd like to thank the Democracy Dialogues for creating this space for us to have these conversations across different viewpoints. Now, I have some questions from the audience that I'd like to begin with. Ambassador Stephen Mull notes, Professor Berkowitz describes Chinese policy towards Taiwan as a subset of a drive for quote unquote hegemony of the Chinese Communist Party in Asia. Does such a formulation, as opposed to describing policy of the government of China, risk suggesting that the current Chinese government lacks legitimacy, creating an impression the U.S. is seeking regime change and making it even harder to de-escalate current tensions and protect U.S. interests on Taiwan or other important issues?
First, if I haven't already, of course, we need to make always distinguish between the Chinese Communist Party and the people of China. I don't think any of the remarks that I've offered suggest that U.S. policy should be a policy of regime change. The United States has always lived with a variety of authoritarian governments, but living with the People's Republic of China, and as my colleagues have already said, finding ways where possible, consistent with American interests, to cooperate with the Chinese is not the same as recognizing the legitimacy of their proceeding by force and against international law, as I believe has happened both with Hong Kong and is happening in the creation of islands in the South China Sea, and far-reaching claims to sovereignty over what are almost universally outside of the PRC regarded as international waters. It is possible to be strongly opposed to all of that without insisting on regime change. And I think all of I and my co-panelists suggested in response to your first question that there are a variety of ways that the United States can increase the costs for China of attempting to seize Taiwan by force. So I just want to emphasize one final point here. America does have an interest in a world that is more committed to individual freedom, human equality, and democratic self-rule. But that commitment does not authorize the United States or entitle the United States to change regimes around the world. Our relations to each country are different, where some countries that will reach out to the United States for assistance in promoting freedom, democracy within. Other countries may be pleased with the authoritarian regimes they have. And in those cases, it seems to me, America's national security interest is to ensure the preservation of a free and open international order, which we helped create in the post-World War II era with our friends and partners. And that free and open international order is an order that is more friendly to, supportive of free and democratic and sovereign nation states. And we should oppose all efforts to transform that order into an order that is more friendly to authoritarian states.
Would either of the other panelists like to add anything to that question?
I might just say, I think that the tendency to define China, when we talk about it as an international actor, as the Chinese Communist Party, has some somewhat inflammatory connotations. It's not necessarily wrong, but maybe it's a little bit like saying, the Democratic Party of the United States. It does sort of signal some kind of separation within the system. And I think for myself, I always just say the Chinese government or, something like that, because I find it introduces a kind of a dissonance into the thinking, at least into my own thinking. And then the other little point that I might add to what Peter was saying, the problem is, in many respects, and we didn't really get into this, is that China has shifted, to exporting autocracy, right? So there was a line, I think it was a Foreign Affairs article, China just wants to make the world, or safe for autocracy. But to me, as China's making the world safe for autocracy, that means it's making it unsafe for democracy, right? And so, Peter described, like, the United States is, a primary objective is to preserve, an open international order. And I agree. The problem is that as China is doing the same kind of political capacity building, still in many cases in still emerging economies, to promote authoritarianism that we do to promote democracy, right? That means that, at the United Nations, when there's a vote on China's action, to censure around Xinjiang, that we can get, 40 odd countries to support our perspective. And China got 62 at the last in 2021. And I think that is a real danger, right? Which maybe we haven't, fully discussed it yet in the panel. It has me extremely concerned, the ability of China to develop, a coterie of supporters for authoritarianism. And, the problem with authoritarianism, of course, is that the leaders certainly usually like it a lot, but a lot of the people in those countries don't, right? And so I think, the problem of how we engage with societies, where there's a lot of turmoil and support them at the same time as China's trying to bolster, the authoritarianism, I think is going to be an increasing challenge.
Oh, that's an excellent point. And thank you for bringing it up to the attention of the panel. Dr. Kim, would you like to add anything?
Just real brief. I agree that the regime change language is not useful. It doesn't help us work towards sort of a sustainable and managed relationship with China. I think, and I'll just note here, given the fact that we're going to be in a competitive relationship with China for the decades to come, I think it's very critical for our leaders to think about how do we talk about this competition in a way that doesn't undermine our interests and in a way that doesn't fuel racism at home. That's a topic that's also important that hasn't come up, in a way that it's not characterized as a civilizational or a racial struggle. And so I think there have been different attempts to talk about U.S. China competition. And I think the previous administration, that's why they said they started using the CCP instead of just talking about the Chinese government. And so I think a lot of good thought needs to be given on how do you talk about the U.S.-China relationship, this competitive relationship, so that it doesn't lead us to bad places.
Thank you. This is a question for all of the panelists. China's ruling party is trying to alter international rules and norms on human rights, cyber, and trade so as to favor their authoritarian capitalist regime. This is from John Owen. The US, meanwhile, has long promulgated rules and norms that favor liberal democracy. So a lot is at stake, not only the rules, but the relative competitiveness of democracy and authoritarianism. Can the US and China come to a deal on the international order in these areas? Or are two separate but overlapping international orders likely to emerge? And I think Professor Economy has started to address this, but I'd love to hear the perspectives of all the panelists on this question.
Maybe I'll just offer one more thought on it, and then others can chime in. And that is absolutely. I mean, you see this battle playing out in the United Nations, across the full range of issues that the questioner raised. And I think the Trump administration actually did a good job, despite the fact that President Trump was pulling us out of all of these international organizations and agreements. Really just transforming the sense of the United States as, leader of the international order. There was a significant effort to push back against China within the United Nations. So when China would try to push forward on, have Belt and Road Initiative language written into all of these things like the, reauthorization bill for the UN mission to Afghanistan, the U.S. pushed back and said, no, you can't have that. And so I think there was like the alarm bells sounded during the Trump administration. And I think the Biden administration is really, because the Biden administration has returned to a much more traditional understanding of U.S. leadership on the global stage, is very active in international organizations, is not only pushing back, but is attempting to reassert the U.S. leadership and U.S. values. I think that's really important. So my view is there's not going to be much of a middle ground here, not on human rights, not on internet governance, where, China has this idea for new IP, which basically means that the state, will be able, to control the internet connection to any device anywhere. And so that's not something that the US and other democracies really want to see happen. So I think the gap between us is so vast right now that maybe in the trade realm, we can continue to battle it out and find some accommodation, maybe. But I think on the other two, we're really many degrees of separation apart.
Professor Berkowitz?
Yes, again, picking up where Liz left off and responding to the great question from my old friend, John Owen. I think, yes, we are in a contest over the nature of world order. The United States is committed to free and open international order. I think Xi Jinping is made clear that he rejects that order and wants to transform international order to make it more friendly to authoritarianism, as I've said, and place Beijing at the center. I believe we've got to work aggressively. I would add to actually what Liz said, that actually in addition to reviving the Quad, the Trump administration, especially the Pompeo-led State Department, worked aggressively and successfully to ensure that the Chinese candidate did not lead the World Intellectual Property Organization. That was a big victory, I think, for both international organizations and for norms of freedom. Another initiative of the Trump administration, which should be an initiative of both parties, was the efforts by Undersecretary of State Keith Krach to persuade countries around the world and large countries and large companies around the world to sign on to the Clean Network. What is the Clean Network? A commitment effectively not to have Huawei or ZTE provide your digital software or build the physical infrastructure for your 5G networks, because that threatens to provide a pipeline of sensitive information to back to China. One quick comment: it was good for the Obama administration to recognize the importance of the Indo-Pacific and to speak of a pivot to Asia. But there is a problem with just that rhetoric. A pivot implies turning around, turning your face toward one thing and your back on another. But the China challenge really is a challenge that is playing out around the world, in every region of the world, not just emanates, you can say, from the Indo-Pacific, its center of gravity is there, but in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe, in the Western Hemisphere, and that means South America and North America too. I think it was Liz, maybe Patricia too, made reference to Chinese disinformation surrounding, I think, both COVID-19 and January 6th. We have to pay the most careful attention to this challenge over the nature of international order in the Indo-Pacific and in every region of the world.
Dr. Kim, is there anything you'd like to add?
Sure. So I would agree with a lot of what has been said by both panelists. I think there are significant differences when it comes to China and the United States' respective visions for global order. I think, as Liz said, I think in order to ensure that the United States doesn't just stand by as China starts to reshape certain institutions or definitions of what human rights means, for instance, it's really going to take the U.S. Showing up at all the various international and regional organizations and forums. I think China has really done a significant job of amplifying its presence at all kinds of committees at the UN and so on, where it's trying to change the definition of certain terms or trying to change the rules and norms in a way that favors its own system. So I think showing up really matters. These places are not just the US and China in the room. Of course, there are other countries as well. So I think coordinating with allies and partners to ensure that we're shaping the world order in a way that is safe for democracies is important. And of course, and this is what I would say that you don't want to split the world into democracies versus autocracies, though. I don't think this is helpful framing, because there are a lot of states that are in the middle that might not feel comfortable identifying as a democracy. And so maybe they, if you say, oh, there's only two sides, then they might actually join the China side. Mm. And so you need to think about, how do you work with countries, maybe developing states where they've struggled with democratic governance, but they're backsliding into autocracy. How do you work with these sort of middle countries and bring them, I don't want to say on our side, but to bring, to increase democratic governance in their countries, capacity build, and so on, and ensure that they're on the right side of the conversation that we're having about various rules and norms at the UN and so on. I mean, I think that's also something that needs to be given more thought.
So we have another really important question that that Professor Kim, or that Dr. Kim had started to address earlier. So the U.S. has seen a rise in anti-Asian hate speech and crimes that are wrapped up in disinformation about the pandemic and theories about COVID-19's origins in China. What are some ways that we can start to address these challenges, and how might these efforts relate to the preservation of democratic norms in the United States? And Dr. Kim, since you began, would you be willing to take that question first?
Sure. So I think we've clearly seen a rise in anti-Asian sentiment here in the United States. I think a lot of this was fueled by some of the previous administration's rhetoric around the pandemic, especially the President Trump's rhetoric about COVID-19 as a Chinese virus and so on, and that was not helpful. And as I said, I think this is also driven by the fact that we're going into a competitive stage with China. And so I think it's very important that when our leaders talk about competing with China, it doesn't mean ethnic Chinese or the Chinese people. And I think we really need to strike the right balance so when we talk about Chinese disinformation campaigns here in the US, or Chinese influence through apps like WeChat here in the US, and concerns, how do you separate out sort of the legitimate national security concerns and ensure that we're not just targeting Chinese citizens or Chinese Americans, we're not targeting their communities, that we're not feeling racism? I mean, there's just so much that needs to be worked through. And so I think we really need a strong leadership on this. I think the Biden administration, again, has done a good job of calling out or rejecting the rise of anti-Asian sentiment here in the US, but we need a lot more by leaders on all sides of the spectrum.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Would either of the other panelists like to add?
I'll be happy to jump in and emphasize that bigotry and intoleration have no place in the United States. I think the first place to begin is a better job in our schools of teaching the principles of toleration, of civility, of pluralism. It's very important. We need to do a better job in the United States of explaining this is not just schools, but our political leaders as well, Democratic and Republican, that human rights, the idea that there are rights that all human beings share, is not some sort of new add-on, post-World War II add-on to the American political tradition, important as it was for the United States to vote in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But human rights are central to our tradition. We need to aggressively protect the rights of all of our citizens. Having said all that, it seems to me we have to reject the notion that telling the truth about the systematic violations of human rights committed by the Chinese government, but also I do want to say by the Chinese Communist Party, is racist. Secretary Pompeo, I believe, was very careful in his speeches to always distinguish between Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, and other Chinese. And I do differ a bit with my colleague Liz here. It's not the same to refer to the CCP and refer to the Democratic Party as in the United States, because now the Democrats hold the White House. We are a two-party system under the Constitution. As long as China, the CCP runs China as the government, as a single party, it seems to me it's accurate to also refer to it. I want to make one other point. I believe hardly anybody did more than Secretary Pompeo to call attention to the crimes against humanity, not only the crimes against humanity and the genocide in Xinjiang, but the oppression of Tibetans, the oppression of ethnic Mongolians, the oppression of 70 million Christians in China, and not least this, Secretary Pompeo emphasized the oppression of 1.4 billion Chinese who live under the most comprehensive and intrusive surveillance state the world has ever seen. Properly understood, I believe that those kinds of criticisms of the Chinese government led by the Chinese Communist Party show that U.S. policy then, and I believe U.S. policy now, is directed against the violations of human rights and has nothing to do with racism. Stop there.
Dr. or Professor Economy, would you like to make a final comment?
Sure, I'll be brief. I mean, I think, Patty is right that, some of the rhetoric and the language by some members of the Trump administration, I think most notably the president, really were, disgusting, actually, and really inflamed racism and made it okay in this country in ways that I don't think I've seen in my lifetime. In any case, certainly we've had it in our country before, but not in my lifetime. So it's now, I think, a function of repairing, and I think Peter's right. It does go back to our educational system and to understanding tolerance, to remembering that we're all immigrants. We're all immigrants. Like, I don't know when we forgot that notion, but everybody came from somewhere, and we are all equal. And so, how we've forgotten this and haven't educated enough people to appreciate this, I don't know. I think we ought to be celebrating the achievements of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans and bringing them up. I think one of the things that the current administration is trying to do also is to ensure that we have very significant racial diversity, throughout our government. And I think that is really important, to be able to look to see that the people that are leading you look like you, right? Or may have similar backgrounds to yours. And I think that's something that has been also helped by Black Lives Matter as well. So I think there's a lot going on in our country today, and I certainly can't do justice to this issue in any way. I'll make one final point that's going to sound sort of dissonant with what I've just said, but I think it's also important, and that is, I think, prominent Chinese American groups like the Committee of 100 I think they play a really important role in trying to ensure that the US government doesn't overreach. We've had some cases, obviously, where, cases against, Chinese American scientists have been publicized and they've, had this, attack mode, and then it's turned out these people are innocent. This is terrible, right? We have to do a better job around this. And I think the Chinese American community does a good job of helping to hold the government to account. But I also think it's important that prominent Chinese Americans stand up and say what's going on in China and China's efforts, influence operations inside the United States. That's not okay also. And so I want to make that point because I think, part of the problem too is that Xi Jinping has put a target on the back of all Chinese Americans by saying, everybody everywhere in the world that's of Chinese descent in any way should be working toward the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, in service of the Chinese motherland. And that's problematic, and we need to push back against that. That is not the job of the Chinese Americans. So I think there are a lot of issues tied up in this, and I certainly can't do them justice, but I just put those out there for debate and discussion.
And these are, I want to thank all the panelists for their candor and for talking about these challenging international and domestic issues. Right now, we have about 4 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is pose one final question, but I'm going to invite you to take 1 minute either to respond to the question or to give your final thoughts on a wrap up, any final words that you'd like to say about anything of the panel. And that's, again, one brief, succinct, very timely minute. So our final question is from Susan Bradley. Why did the protests in Hong Kong fail, and what can we learn from that failure as we move forward in trying to help Taiwan? So basically a general question about democracy in Hong Kong. This is complicated, so please feel free to either just add your closing remarks, or if you'd like to address that, I welcome you to do so. And we will start with Professor Economy and finish with Dr. Kim.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Why did the protests fail? Because the Chinese Communist Party, mainland China, was sitting behind and would never let them succeed. And because Hong Kong was recognized formally as, part of mainland Chinese sovereignty, and, legally in international law, even though one country, two systems was supposed to prevail. And because, this isn't why they failed, but we had a certain hubris in the United States that passing things like the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which promised basically to take away all of Hong Kong's special privileges, if China did do something, if one country, two systems were not preserved, we had a certain hubris that this somehow would deter Beijing. And it wouldn't deter Beijing, because Beijing doesn't care about Hong Kong as a center of, economic, sort of a global center of, the economy and the financial center. It cares about sovereignty, and that's its number one priority. And for me, the lesson of Hong Kong is such an important one for Taiwan, is that sovereignty trumps all, and that China will, and Xi Jinping has a very high risk tolerance, and he will undertake action in Taiwan and risk economic consequences if he feels that he has no other option.
President Berkowitz?
A quick 60-second story. In October of 2019, Jimmy Lai, the great Hong Kong freedom and democracy activist, was interviewed at the Hoover Institution by my colleague our colleague Peter Robinson, this colleague and mine, and he was at the end of a 30-minute presentation. He was asked, this was 2019, before the crushing of freedom in 2020, what can the United States do to support you and your movement? Jimmy Lai paused for a moment and then said with great poignancy, I will tell you, in Hong Kong, we do not need more tanks from the United States. We do not need higher tariffs or lower tariffs from the United States. We need for the United States to cease being embarrassed by its values. We need the United States to champion its principles more effectively.
I'm glad Liz and Peter went first. They covered a lot of ground in 1 minute, and I agree with a lot of what was said. I think what was happening and what's happened in Hong Kong is sort of reflective of what's going on in China overall. There's just been an overall tightening of everything, a real sort of deepening of autocracy in China. And so I think that's the trend for some time going forward. Having said that, there are many people who are not happy with what's happening, especially the people of Hong Kong, but many intellectuals and others who value their freedom of expression in China. And so what can the US do? I think the biggest thing the US can do is really improve its own improve its own soft power. The power of the United States democratic model has often served as a very influential force for inspiring people who live in authoritarian systems like China. So I think doing better to fix up our own democracy here at home can serve as a great impetus for people who are looking towards us as a model around the world.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their rich answers, for their rich feedback, for their rich discussions amongst one another about these challenging issues. And I'd like to thank all of our wonderful audience for their great questions. And I wish all of you lots of rich dialogue moving forward. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.